question that would haunt anyone who witnessed it was simple, sharp, and merciless. How many times can a woman fall before the world finally allows her to stand? On that frozen afternoon, the Montana wind answered with a howl that cut through layers of wool and bone, scraping across the empty road as Ellie Warren staggered through it with her daughter clutched against her chest. Maddie's tiny fingers were stiff, too cold to tremble, too starved to hold on. Snow clung to Ellie's lashes, blurring the world into a white, uncaring haze, and the crunch of her boots on the brittle ground grew slower, softer, until even that fragile rhythm failed. She collapsed on the wooden boardwalk in front of Halston's general store, the sound barely more than a sigh before her body went still. Inside, through frosted windows, townsfolk pretended not to look. Some glanced at each other, others tightened their scarves, but none moved to open the door. And when Rick Halston finally appeared, framed by the warm glow of his store's lanterns, his expression held no flicker of concern. He glanced down at Ellie the way a man inspects a stain on the floor, annoyed by its presence. "You still owe me $12, he said, voice sharp enough to carry over the wind. "No credit, not a crumb." Maddie stirred weakly, and Halston's gaze hardened, as if their suffering was some personal offense. Ellie tried to push herself upright, but her limbs refused to obey. Pride flickered across her features, an instinct, a memory, but it could not fight hunger. Her voice cracked as she whispered for help, and Halston only stepped back inside, shutting the door with finality. It wasn't cruelty born from impulse. It was the kind crafted over years, sharpened into habit. For a moment, the wind swallowed everything. The silence of the onlookers, the thud of the closing door, the soft whimper of a child too tired to cry. Ellie's world dimmed around the edges. Snow gathered on her coat. Maddie's breath grew shallow. The street stretched empty in both directions, and the world itself seemed to step away from them. Then came the sound of hooves, slow and hesitant, as if the rider wasn't sure he belonged anywhere. A worn wagon rolled into view, pulled by a horse with more ribs than muscle, and atop it sat a man whose face seemed carved from weather and hardship. A scar traced from his brow to his jaw, pale against wind-burned skin. He looked like someone the frontier had nearly broken, but refused to release. Caleb Boone reined in the horse the moment he saw them, his posture tightening with alarm. In 2 strides, he was off the wagon and kneeling beside Ellie. His gloved hand touched her cheek, feeling for a warmth she no longer had. "Ma'am," he murmured, voice low, steady and unexpectedly gentle. "You hold on now." Maddie whimpered again, and Caleb swept her into his arms without hesitation. She weighed almost nothing. Ellie tried to speak but only managed a rasp, her eyes unfocused until they caught his. The shock there wasn't fear. It was disbelief that anyone had stopped. Caleb lifted Ellie with a strength that wasn't showy, but born from necessity. When Halston cracked the door open again, perhaps sensing opportunity, Caleb shot him a look that froze the man in place. It wasn't a threat. It was disappointment. Quiet, cutting, and more damning than violence. Halston slammed the door, and the townsfolk faded once more into their corners. Caleb carried Ellie and Maddie to the wagon, wrapping them in the single, heavy blanket he owned, tucking it around them as if protecting something breakable. Snow swirled around him, finding its way into seams and scars. But he ignored it, climbing onto the seat and turning the horse toward the distant tree line. The cabin he aimed for wasn't his. He had none. But he'd seen enough shelters in his drifting years to guess where a widow might be trying to survive alone. The trail grew rough, wind forcing the wagon to sway. But Caleb kept his grip steady. Inside the blanket, Ellie drifted in and out of consciousness, catching moments of sound, wooden wheels, Maddie's faint breathing, Caleb murmuring to the horse to keep going. There was no pity in his voice, only purpose, the kind that rises when a good man remembers what he once lost. By the time they reached the cabin, a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, evidence of Ellie's last desperate attempt to keep her daughter alive. The door creaked under Caleb's boot, and he carried them inside, the warmth barely enough to notice. He lowered Ellie onto the small bed and set Maddie beside her. Then he moved with silent urgency, feeding the fire, sealing gaps in the walls, covering the windows with patched cloth. He found a pot, filled it from a barrel, and began heating water. Every motion was practiced, the reflex of someone who had learned to keep others alive even when he couldn't save his own. When Ellie finally stirred, the fire cast a soft glow across Caleb's scarred profile as he knelt beside Maddie, coaxing tiny sips of warm broth between her lips. Ellie's voice trembled as she asked, "Why help us?" Caleb didn't look up. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it," he answered, quiet but firm. "And because no one should be left to freeze on a street while a town watches." Outside, the wind clawed at the cabin walls. Inside, the room held a fragile, growing warmth that neither of them fully understood yet. Ellie watched him, realizing that the stranger who appeared in the moment she most needed hope was not merely passing through her life. His arrival had shifted something fundamental, something she could feel even in her weakness. Caleb Boone had stepped into her world like a force the frontier could not blunt. A man shaped by sorrow, driven by decency, and destined to challenge the cruelty that had nearly broken her. And in that moment, though she did not yet know it, the course of all their lives had changed. The blizzard closed in before dawn, swallowing the forest in sheets of white so dense they erased the horizon. By the time Ellie's eyes fluttered open, the cabin walls groaned under the weight of wind, and snow smothered the world beyond the windows. She blinked up at the ceiling, warm for the first time in days, her breath no longer forming a ghostly cloud in the air. The fire still burned, fed through the night, and Caleb Boone sat near it, sleeves rolled, hands working over a cracked board he was mending with quiet focus. He looked like a man who had spent his life repairing things that weren't his, because he didn't know how to stop trying. Maddie slept curled beside Ellie, her cheeks flushed with returning color. Ellie brushed a hand over her daughter's hair, relief settling over her like a fragile blanket. It took a moment for Caleb to realize she was awake. When he turned, the firelight traced the scar down his cheek. He nodded once, a small gesture, but somehow more reassuring than words. "You're safe," he said softly, as if speaking any louder might break the warmth they'd managed to build. "Both of you." Ellie tried to push herself upright, but her limbs remained heavy from hunger and cold. Caleb crossed the room with a steadiness that made her feel seen but not fragile. He lifted a steaming mug of broth. "Slow sips," he murmured. "Your body needs time." She obeyed, and every swallow felt like life returning. Outside, the wind roared, rattling the shutters. Caleb added more wood to the fire, then checked the patched window seams. His movements were precise, methodical, like a man who'd spent too long relying only on himself and still didn't trust the quiet. "How bad is it?" Ellie asked, voice hoarse. "Bad enough that no one's coming up here," Caleb replied. "Storm will trap us in for a few days." He hesitated, watching her reaction. "I'll stay until you're through it." Ellie lowered her eyes, a knot forming in her chest. Gratitude warred with a fear she'd carried for years, fear of needing someone, anyone, in a world where help often came with a price. But Caleb returned to his repairs without pressing her. He was close, yet somehow gave her space, as if he understood the boundaries she built to survive. Hours passed in the rhythm of the storm. Caleb cooked what little food remained in Ellie's pantry, rationing it with practiced care. He set a plate in front of her and one in front of Maddie when she woke. Maddie stared at him through sleepy eyes, unsure at first, then whispered, "Are you an angel?" And Caleb froze mid-motion. The question hung in the air, almost painful. He crouched beside her, his voice roughened by something beyond the cold. "No, little one. I'm just a man trying to do right." Maddie, in the effortless way children sense truth, accepted this and leaned against Ellie. Caleb watched them a moment longer, like someone studying a memory he didn't dare keep. By evening, the storm intensified, forcing the cabin into a dim, trembling cocoon. Shadows flickered across the walls as Caleb repaired a hinge on the door. Ellie finally spoke into the quiet between them. "You didn't have to do any of this." Caleb didn't look up. "Someone had to." "That's not what I mean," she said, fingers gripping the blanket. "People in town, they don't help. They don't even look at us. I thought that was just how things were now." Caleb paused, setting down his tools. His expression softened, carrying a weight she recognized instantly. Loss that had shaped him, just as hers had shaped her. "When my wife and daughter died," he began slowly, "I stopped believing in a lot of things. Home, God, myself." He exhaled. "But one night, when I was damn near ready to give up, a stranger found me. Didn't ask who I was or what I'd done wrong. Just pulled me out of the cold and fed me. Told me kindness isn't something you earn. It's something you pass on." Ellie swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. "And you've been passing it on ever since?" Caleb's gaze drifted to the fire. "Trying to. Doesn't always feel like enough." The revelation cracked something inside her. Something brittle she'd kept locked away since the day soldiers came to her door with her husband's folded uniform. She drew a shaky breath. "After James died, people stopped seeing me as a person. I was just a widow, a burden, another mouth they didn't want to feed." She forced the words out. "I didn't expect anyone to stop today, especially not someone like you." Caleb's eyes lifted. "Someone like me?" "A man who knows what it means to hurt," Ellie said quietly, "and still chooses to be gentle." The silence that followed was thick with something neither of them dared name. Outside, the storm beat against the walls like a warning. Yet inside, the air warmed with a fragile, unexpected connection. Caleb returned to his seat, but the distance between them no longer felt like a wall. Ellie watched him through the glow of the fire, noticing the exhaustion in his shoulders, the sharp loneliness etched into his face. She wondered how long he'd been drifting, how many nights he'd spent wishing someone, anyone, had asked him to stay. Later, when the wind howled loud enough to shake the chimney, Ellie woke to find Caleb standing guard by the door, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the windows as if danger could rise from the storm itself. He wasn't protecting the cabin. He was protecting them. "You should rest," she whispered. He shook his head. "I'm fine." She knew the lie. Men who carried ghosts didn't sleep easily. Ellie sat up, pulling the blanket around Maddie. "Caleb, you're safe here too." He looked at her. Truly looked. And something unspoken passed between them. A truth neither of them were ready to voice. Trust was forming, piece by fragile piece, in the heart of a storm that could have killed them all. As the night deepened, the boundaries between survival and longing blurred, and the dangerous hope of a new life flickered like a flame, refusing to die. They were strangers bound by loss, but the storm had made them something else. Companions in the quiet darkness, witnesses to each other's wounds. And when dawn finally crept across the horizon, Neither Ellie nor Caleb realized that the 3 days trapped in that cabin would shape every choice that came after, binding their futures in ways they could not yet imagine. When the blizzard finally broke and the world emerged from its white cocoon, the calm that settled over the valley felt deceptive. Too still, too bright, as if the storm had only paused to let something darker step forward. Ellie felt it the moment she opened the cabin door, the cold air biting at her lungs while Caleb chopped wood nearby. Maddie played in a patch of sunlit snow, humming softly. For the first time in months, the girl looked like a child again, rather than a shadow of one. But peace in Montana never lasted long, not when men like Rick Halston held the reins of the town's gossip and fear. By noon, the first whispers reached Ellie's ears. Mrs. Dunley, one of the few townsfolk whose conscience hadn't yet frozen over, stopped Ellie on the road with a pinched expression. "You best be careful, Eleanor," she murmured, glancing around as if the trees themselves might be listening. "Halston's saying things, ugly things. Says you took that drifter into your home, says it's indecent, unchristian." Ellie froze. Her fingers tightened around the small bag of flour she'd managed to barter for. Shame, frustration, and exhaustion battled in her chest. But even stronger was the sharp sting of injustice. After everything she'd survived, after nearly freezing to death on Halston's doorstep, the town had chosen to judge her for accepting a stranger's kindness. When Ellie returned to the cabin, Caleb saw the storm in her eyes long before she spoke. He wiped sweat from his brow, leaned his axe against a stump, and stepped closer. Something happened. She didn't know how to say the words without letting them corrode her spirit. "Halston's telling people I'm immoral," she whispered. "He's using you to shame me." Caleb's jaw tightened. The scar along his cheek seemed sharper when anger settled beneath his skin. "Let him talk," he said quietly, but she could hear the strain in his voice. "Truth doesn't need defending. In this town it does." Ellie stared out over the valley, her breath trembling. "And you know what he's capable of." As if summoned by her fear, a letter arrived the next morning. A notice from the county office stating that her land claim was being challenged. Halston had filed a petition claiming the homestead improvements were insufficient, that she had failed to maintain the land, and that the property should revert to auction. It was a weapon disguised as paperwork. Ellie's hands shook as she held the letter. "He wants to take everything," she whispered. "Even the ground my husband died believing we could build a life on." Caleb didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached for the letter, reading each line with a focus that felt like a promise. "You still have the documents your husband left?" he asked. "In a box under the floorboards." "Then he's not taking anything," Caleb said firmly. "We'll fight this." The certainty in his voice steadied her, though fear still curled in her ribs. The idea of going to court, standing before men who had never cared for her, felt like walking willingly into another storm. But Caleb's presence changed something fundamental. She was no longer facing it alone. On the morning of the hearing, Ellie braided Maddie's hair with trembling hands. Caleb saddled his horse in the pale dawn, his expression unreadable. But the tension in him was unmistakable. Townsfolk gathered as they rode in, forming small clusters of murmurs. Their stares followed Ellie like thorns dragging across her skin. Inside the courthouse, Rick Halston stood near the front, dressed in a fine wool coat, smirking as if victory had already been carved in stone. His lawyer, a man paid well for selective morality, shuffled papers, preparing to argue that Ellie was unfit to hold land, too poor to maintain it, too helpless to deserve it. But when Ellie took the stand, something in the room shifted. She spoke with quiet, steady resolve, holding the folded documents her husband had left her. The air tightened as she described James Warren's service in the cavalry. the land he had secured through lawful claim, and the years she had spent fighting to maintain it after his death. Her voice trembled only once, when she described Maddie nearly starving in the cold. But she did not falter. Halston's lawyer objected more than once, but the judge, an older man who had watched the town slip under Halston's influence, silenced him with a raised hand. Let her speak. Then came the witnesses. One by one, those long intimidated by Halston stepped forward. Mr. Kelsey, the blacksmith, testified to Halston's history of running families off their land. Mrs. Dunley spoke about Ellie's struggle to survive after losing her husband. Even young Tom Reeves admitted Halston had offered him payment to spread rumors about Ellie and Caleb. Halston paled, but he stood his ground, denying everything. She's lying, he snapped. They all are. She's just using that drifter. Caleb rose from his seat before Halston could finish. His voice was low, but the room quieted instantly. I didn't come here for a fight, he said. I came because this woman and her child were dying, and no one else stepped forward. He paused, eyes locked on Halston. If you want to judge someone, judge me. But Ellie Warren is the strongest, most honest person I've ever known. And whether you believe it or not, He hesitated. Then he said the words with a clarity that silenced even the whispering. I love her. And I will stand with her, in or out of this courtroom. The admission struck Ellie like a blow. Gentle, devastating, undeniable. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Halston sputtered in rage. Ellie felt tears rise, but forced them back. This moment wasn't about love alone. It was about dignity. Hers, her husband's memory, her daughter's future. The judge called for order, then delivered his ruling with deliberate weight. Ellie Warren's claim was valid. Halston's petition was rejected. And given the testimonies, the judge recommended a full investigation into Halston's conduct, including potential coercion, fraud, and intimidation. It was as if the town exhaled for the first time in years. Halston stormed out of the courtroom, red-faced and seething, but Caleb and Ellie didn't watch him go. They stood together, Maddie running into Ellie's arms, the world around them bursting into fragile, impossible relief. For the first time since the winter began, Ellie felt something she had nearly forgotten how to hold. Hope, not the timid kind, but the sharp, rising kind that pushed back against darkness. The kind that made survival feel like the beginning, not the end. The victory in court should have felt like an ending. A moment where the weight on Ellie's shoulders finally eased. But the days that followed carried a strange tension. An uneasy quiet that reminded her of the calm before a storm. Caleb sensed it too. He lingered near windows, checked the cabin door twice each night, and scanned the tree line as if expecting shadows to move. Ellie tried to reassure him, though she didn't believe her own comfort. A man like Rick Halston didn't accept defeat. He swallowed it, let it fester, and waited for the moment he could strike back. That moment arrived 3 nights after the hearing. Caleb spotted 2 riders on the ridge at dusk, silhouettes against the dying sun, watching the cabin without approaching. When he stepped outside with his rifle, they turned their horses and retreated into the timber. He told Ellie it might be nothing, but she heard the tightness in his breath. Later, while Maddie slept between quilts, Caleb sat at the table sharpening a knife by lantern light. The scrape of steel echoed through the cabin, rhythmic and cold. In town, whispers turned brittle. Halston had vanished for a day, then 2, before returning with a swagger that didn't belong on a man under investigation. He walked the streets with a folded document tucked beneath his arm and a look that promised trouble. Most avoided him, but fear traveled faster than footsteps. By the end of the week, Ellie heard the rumors. Halston claimed he had new evidence, a document proving her late husband had relinquished the homestead before his death. Ellie's hands trembled when Caleb handed her the notice the county courier delivered. A summons to a second hearing. Attached was a copy of the supposed document. It bore James Warren's signature. But the ink looked too fresh, the handwriting unnatural, and the date impossibly convenient. "This is a lie," Ellie whispered, pressing the page against her chest as if she could shield her husband's memory from the insult. "James would never." "He didn't," Caleb said firmly. "This is forgery." But there was a shadow behind his anger, one that came from knowing how fragile justice could be in a land where power outweighed truth. Things worsened quickly. Halston returned to the outskirts of Ellie's property with 5 armed men, rough drifters with open coats and greedy eyes. They camped a half-mile away, their fire bright enough to be a threat. At night, their laughter drifted through the trees like a taunt. Maddie began waking from nightmares, clinging to Ellie, asking if the bad men would take their home. Caleb paced the length of the cabin, jaw clenched. "If he pushes any further, I'll deal with him myself." Ellie stepped in front of him. "You can't. That's what he wants. Something he can twist against us. I'm not letting him scare you," Caleb snapped. "You're not protecting just me," she whispered. "You're protecting Maddie too. We need the law on our side, not bloodshed." Her words steadied him, though the anger didn't leave his eyes. Caleb wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid of failing them. 2 mornings later, Halston made his move. He arrived at the cabin's clearing with his men, brandishing the forged deed as if it were gospel. "This land is mine now," he declared. "You have until sundown to get off it." Maddie hid behind Ellie. Caleb stepped outside, rifle slung across his back but hands empty, posture calm, too calm. "You come any closer," Caleb warned, "and you won't leave standing." Halston laughed, a hollow sound. Big talk from a runaway drifter. His gaze slid to Ellie. "You should have taken my offer when you had the chance. You could have lived a decent life under my roof." Ellie felt heat rush through her veins. Anger, humiliation, and something sharper. "I would rather freeze in the dirt than owe you a breath." Halston's expression twisted. He gestured for his men to advance, but before they did, hoofbeats thundered through the trees. 6 riders emerged into the clearing, rifles ready, faces grim. At the front was Jake Porter, the former cavalryman who'd always watched the town with quiet vigilance. His voice boomed across the clearing. "That's far enough, Halston." Halston spun toward him. "This is none of your concern." "It is," Porter said, reining in his horse. "Because that land belongs to Ellie Warren. Because this town's tired of your threats. And because you forged that deed." Halston's face drained of color. "You can't prove that." Porter lifted a leather-bound ledger. "Actually, I can. County clerk found you tried to bribe him the same day this document appeared. He signed a sworn statement." Another rider handed Ellie an envelope. Official papers bearing the county seal. Porter nodded at Caleb with the understanding of men who'd both fought through too many battles. "We're here to stand with them." The tension in the air shifted. Halston's men glanced at one another, suddenly less confident now that they were outnumbered. One even lowered his gun. Halston, frantic, barked orders no one obeyed. "Ride home, Rick," Porter said, "before this ends worse for you." For a moment, Halston looked like a cornered animal, trapped between rage and fear. Then, realizing he'd lost, he spat into the snow, turned on his heel, and fled with the few men who still followed him. They rode hard, disappearing into the trees like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Silence settled over the clearing. Ellie exhaled a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Caleb stepped to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. Maddie ran into Ellie's arms. Relief, exhaustion, and disbelief swirled inside her until she could barely stand. Porter dismounted, removing his hat with solemn respect. "You're safe now," he said. "He won't be back, and the county's filing charges. Once they're through with him, he'll be lucky to make it out of the territory alive." Ellie's voice trembled. "Why help us?" Porter exchanged a look with the riders behind him. "Because it was time someone did," he said. "This town needed to find its spine again. You just gave us the reason." Caleb nodded slowly, pride and gratitude settling into his features. "Thank you," he said. And the words carried weight. The kind that spoke of debts he intended to honor for the rest of his life. As the riders dispersed and the clearing quieted, Ellie felt something shift inside her. A release, like a knot loosening after years of being pulled tight. The danger was gone. The shadows were lifting. For the first time since she'd buried her husband, the world felt survivable again. And beside her, Caleb stood steady and unshaken, the kind of man storms couldn't break. The kind of man who fought not just with strength, but with the unwavering belief that some things, some people, were worth fighting for. Spring arrived quietly that year, softening the edges of winter as if the land itself wished to erase the memory of all that had nearly been lost. Snow melted into clear ribbons along the valley, and birds returned to the pines with songs that felt like promises. Ellie Warren stood on the cabin porch one morning, Maddie leaning against her side, both watching Caleb Boone mend the fence that would soon mark the boundary of their new life. There was no threat on the horizon now, no riders in the distance, no rumors creeping through town, no shadow of Rick Halston clawing at their peace. The danger had passed, and the silence that remained was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of beginning. Ellie found herself watching Caleb often in these early weeks after Halston fled the territory, studying the way he moved with steady intention, how he checked on Maddie first thing each morning, how he made sure the fire was strong before leaving to chop wood, how he asked nothing in return. He had drifted all his life, but here he stood as though he had always belonged to this patch of land, this valley, this family that was slowly learning to trust its own happiness. Ellie felt the ache of something tender awakening inside her, something she feared at first but no longer tried to deny. One evening, as the sky stretched into violet dusk, Caleb returned from town with a quiet smile tugging at his mouth. Ellie sensed the shift in him immediately. "They're clearing the charges," he said. "Halston's name is blackened across the county. Sheriff says he won't dare show his face again." Ellie nodded, relief rising like breath long held underwater. Maddie, hearing the tone more than the words, wrapped her arms around Caleb's waist, resting her head against him. He froze for a heartbeat, emotion flickering across his face, then bent to lift her into his arms. Maddie laughed, pure and bright, as Ellie watched them bathed in the warm dusk light. In that moment, something inside Caleb broke open. The last wall he'd built to keep himself from wanting too much. That night, after Maddie was asleep, Caleb stood near the doorway as Ellie tended the fire. The flames cast long shadows across his features, revealing both strength and uncertainty. "Ellie," he said quietly, "I never planned on staying anywhere. I didn't think I could, not after everything that happened." He stepped closer, the sound of his boots slow, hesitant. "But I want to build something here. With you. With Maddie. If you'll let me." Ellie felt the world shift under her feet, not with fear, but with a deep, resonant certainty. "Caleb," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve, "you saved us long before the court or the townspeople did. You brought us warmth when the world went cold. If you want to stay, then stay. This is your home too." Caleb didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached for her hand, holding it with a reverence that made her breath catch. The moment was simple, quiet, unadorned, but it was the beginning of a promise neither needed to speak aloud. A few days later, Caleb rode into town to speak with Reverend Michael Tate, and the preparations for a wedding began. The town, once cold to Ellie, now moved with a strange, generous energy. People who had stayed silent for too long now stepped forward to help. Agnes Whitfield arrived carrying a carefully folded dress, ivory lace aged by decades, but preserved with love. "I wore this when I married my John," she said softly. "He was a good man. Yours will be too." Ellie held the dress as tears gathered in her eyes, but Agnes touched her cheek gently. "You've earned a new beginning, child. Take it." Even the men from the ridge brought gifts. Bundles of wood, flour sacks, small trinkets from families wanting to make amends. The transformation wasn't grand, but it was sincere. It marked a town rediscovering its humanity piece by piece. The wedding took place beside the creek, under a cottonwood tree whose branches had survived every winter the frontier threw at it. Caleb waited with Reverend Tate, adjusting the cuffs of the clean shirt someone had insisted he wear. Maddie stood beside him, proudly clutching a handful of wildflowers. When Ellie stepped into the clearing in Agnes's dress, the world seemed to still. The lace framed her shoulders, the skirt brushed the grass, and her hair glowed softly in the sunlight. Caleb's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the quiet realization that the life he'd thought long lost was standing before him. Reverend Tate spoke simply, letting the wind fill the pauses between his words. Ellie's vows were steady, grounded in truth. She spoke of loss, of fear, of rebuilding herself piece by piece. And she spoke of Caleb, how he arrived like a spark in the darkest hours of winter, how he never asked for anything yet gave everything. Caleb's voice trembled as he vowed to stay, to protect, to build a life worthy of her trust. When Maddie slipped her small hand into his, he paused, overwhelmed. It was the first time he had felt like a father since the day he lost his own child, and the weight of that moment nearly brought him to his knees. When the ceremony ended, Ellie rested her forehead against Caleb's, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe the future was not something to fear. It was something to reach for. In the months that followed, Hope Creek Ranch took shape. Caleb rebuilt the barn with Jake Porter's help. Ellie planted a vegetable patch near the edge of the creek. Maddie, bright, curious, healing, ran between them with laughter that filled the valley. The ranch became a gathering place for neighbors who had once kept their distance. A place where kindness was not rare, but expected. And every night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ellie and Caleb stood together on the porch, arms around each other, watching the land they had fought to protect. The wounds of their pasts didn't vanish. They softened. They became part of the foundation they built, quiet reminders of the lives they had survived and the hope they'd chosen instead. And though the world beyond the valley still carried dangers and uncertainty, Ellie, Caleb, and Maddie faced it together, no longer alone, no longer drifting, but grounded in the one thing they had earned through hardship and love, a home. As the years unfolded, the valley changed with them, softening in the places where it had once been harsh, brightening in the corners where shadows had lingered too long. Ellie often stood on the porch at dusk, feeling the wind slip gently through her hair, carrying reminders of winters past and the quiet promise of seasons still to come. Caleb would join her, resting a steady hand at her back, his touch warm and certain, the touch of a man who had chosen to stay, not out of duty, but out of love. Maddie's laughter drifted from the yard, light and carefree, the sound of a childhood finally reclaimed. And in those moments, Ellie understood something she had once been too broken to see. Hope was not a single moment of rescue, but a life built slowly, day by day, through kindness, through courage, through choosing to open one's heart again. Hope Creek Ranch was not just a home. It was a quiet testament to survival and the gentle, persistent power of love. And as night settled softly over the land, Ellie whispered a thanks. To the stranger who had stopped in the snow, to the family they had become, and to the future opening wide before them. End of article. Good night.